Well, good morning to you from a remote location this morning for Big Hairy News. Good to be with you, George. Good morning.
Good morning.
Uh, yeah, so people who are tuning in and seeing, you'll see that I'm not in my studio. As we're finding this week with a lot of people contributing, there are indeed COVID supply side issues. And the reason I'm not in my studio is a COVID related issue. I don't have COVID, there's nothing like that. But there is a link of chain of command of things sometimes. And it's fallen for me today and probably tomorrow to get me out of my studio. So I'm in here with the headphones on. It won't quite sound as crisp and maybe look as good as usual, but we will make it work, and me and George will run this thing together until we get it all figured out.
Yeah,
So
she'll
you're
be
good,
right.
George. She'll be right.
Yeah.
You can see these are my notes today are on my phone. I don't have my two other screens around me, so I am feeling a little bit naked, but I'm sure we'll make it through. So this morning we are going to be having a chat about the three waters and the admission by the minister yesterday on Q&A that perhaps made in the proposal period of this. We're also going to be having Jenny McGee. Now, Jenny McGee is the nurse who was made world famous by Boris Johnson thanking her. Now, I know that's news from a couple of years ago, but Jenny's back in New Zealand, so we're going to be having a chat with her. And I'm really keen to talk to her about actually nursing in a COVID time and what's happening at the moment from a nursing point of view. So that conversation will be coming up before the end of the hour as well. And as we've done a few times since this has all started, we are going to cross right now live to Ukraine. Journalist Tom Mutch is joining us and with us. Good morning, Tom. Good to have you on.
Well, good morning or good evening / middle of the night as it is here.
Yeah, thank you for joining us and joining us live. I'm very happy to be with you again. We haven't talked to you for a few days, so I thought maybe the first thing we should just do is just kind of throw the ball to you. Last time we talked to you, you'd been into Kiev, you came back to the West. What's the update from the last 3 or 4 days with you, what you're doing, where you've been, and what you're seeing right now?
Alrighty, so I've actually been in a different part of the country. I've actually been in the south. I'm currently in Odessa right now, which is the third biggest city in Ukraine. And it's a very important hub because it's right on the Black Sea. It's a very, very major port city, actually an ancient Russian sort of imperial city, very, very kind of grand and beautiful. And as you can see, on the map that's just been pulled up, there is a major Russian offensive that is heading from the occupied Crimean Peninsula in basically an attempt to cut off Ukraine's entire access to the Black Sea. And so that offensive is now stalled at a city called Mykolaiv, which is about halfway between Odessa and Crimea, where I was where I visited 2 days ago. Now that city is under quite heavy bombardment, quite heavy shelling. We heard a lot of artillery fire going both in towards us and back out towards the Russian positions. So yeah, basically been keeping up with this part of the campaign at the moment. The campaign in the north seems to have stalled so far. They're not getting very close to Kiev, whereas at least as close as they hope to.
Hey, George, bring that map back up. Because I want to ask is, Tom, in an ideal world, would that whole country be red by an ideal world? Would Russia like to have just come in and walked all the way through? And I know that we're saying it's stalled, and we get the sense from lots of news reports that Russia is facing more of a resistance than they thought. But is this would they be happy with this advancement so far, or would they like to have more of the country be red and invaded at the moment?
So I spoke with a guy that I told you about the city Mykolaiv. I spoke with the governor when I was there. As I said, that was 3 days ago now. And he said the Russians' battle plans had them capturing Odessa, where I am, 3 days ago. So imagine that was about a week ago they expected to have control of Odessa. And that's just the southern campaign. He probably expected to have control of Kharkiv, have control of Kiev, and effectively be dictating terms to the Ukrainian government after really about a week to a week and a half of fighting. But it's gone much, much slower for them than expected.
I'm interested. We're seeing footage, especially on your Twitter feed, which, as you know, I'm watching all the time, of what's happening in Kiev at the moment. Have you been back to that part of the world since we last talked to you? It seems that Russia is attacking Kiev and destroying buildings. reported, or you reported, as killing civilians as well. Can you tell us anything
So,
about the capital that you know of at the moment?
so what's been happening in the capital is I have been back to Kiev. The piece that you've got up from me there, I filed from a suburb of Kiev on the very outskirts called Brovary, and the village that I talk about is just about 50 kilometers away from Brovary. Kiev, in the center of the city itself, is actually pretty. I was last there about 4. I'm losing a little bit of track of time. It was about 5 or 6 days ago that I was last in Kiev. Central Kiev is actually pretty calm. There's not much going on there. They've got pretty good anti-air defenses. But it's the outskirts of Kiev, the little towns that kind of surround the main city. They are facing extraordinary heavy casualties, extraordinary heavy fighting. Ostomel, Bucha, and Irpin. And Irpin is unfortunately where we got the very sad news that a journalist colleague of ours was killed today while reporting on the refugee exodus from Irpin. So, yeah, some pretty rough stuff going on in the outskirts of Kiev, or the center of the city still mostly okay for now.
When you report about when it's being reported that civilians are being killed, is that mostly civilians taking up their guns and fighting the Russians, or is it like we heard last week about the maternity hospital being bombed? How do we count the civilian casualties?
Okay, so we go to the laws of war. A civilian who takes up a gun does not have the protection of a civilian in a combat zone. They're a combatant. I'm not saying it's not in this case, a very, very noble and righteous thing to do if your country's being invaded. But technically, under the Geneva Convention, the moment you have a gun in your hand, you're a combatant. I mean, actually, just as a slight aside, if you're a journalist in a war zone, number one rule is you never pick up a weapon, not even to pose with soldiers or anything like that, because you pick up a weapon, you are a combatant, or at least someone who can reasonably be believed to be a combatant. But no, civilian casualties in this case have been civilians hit by shelling, their homes destroyed, or it's been in some cases civilians attempting to flee and having their cars shot up. It's an open question how much of this is deliberate and how much of this is just the Russians being a bit not very good with their discipline, how they're aiming and just being indiscriminate. So whether they're deliberately targeting civilians or they're just so indiscriminate that they just don't care is kind of an open question at this stage. But it's still pretty horrific.
It does kind of raise another question we were going to ask you about. I think, George, you've got some footage there. There are examples of civilians protesting, and it looks like even in this footage they're walking, it looks like there's a military vehicle that they're walking up to or past and protesting, calling them fascist occupiers or fascist occupants. I was wondering, I don't know if you can answer this, but when does a Russian soldier allow a civilian to protest and basically tell them to get the fuck out of their home? And when does a Russian soldier then turn their weapons on that civilian and create a civilian casualty?
So this is, I'm going to have to answer this with a very big kind of conjecture. So I've been speaking to people, including the person who supplied me with that video in Kherson, which is so far the only major city that has been occupied. And basically, it depends in a large amount, what are the numbers and where are they and how many cameras are on them. So, for instance, I've heard a number of cases of in Kherson, in the villages, they find it easier to, if a civilian car pisses them off, they can just shoot them much easier because less people are going to know about it. Now, you start firing into a crowd like that as a Russian soldier, the crowd is going to go absolutely crazy. They're going to start attacking you, and all of a sudden, either you're going to get killed or you're going to have a major, major, major massacre on your hands. It's just going to be even more of a public relations nightmare than this war has been so far. And now also remember that, looking at it from the Russian perspective, massacres here are not going to play in Moscow like, the massacres in Syria did, because, Kherson is a Russian city. It's a Russian-speaking city, I should say. A lot of the people, are ethnic Russians, despite the fact that almost all of those people want to remain part of Ukraine. So it is very, very hard to be mowing down a sea sort of full of civilians and then claiming, oh yes, we're liberating them from these kind of Nazi occupation government, as they've been calling the regime in Kiev, when it's very clear that almost all the people there are, to some degree, opposed to the Russian occupation.
Hey Tom, what do you make of this this debate, I guess, it's probably unrelated to what you're doing on the ground there, but in the West, in America, there's this debate around chemical weapons, right? That Russia is planning on using chemical weapons, and then you get the odd dodgy report that there are American biolabs in Ukraine, and a lot of confusion around this. What do you make of this, and do you think it's possible the use of Russia using chemical weapons?
So it's a question that unfortunately I can't answer with any particular expertise. Like, well, honestly, reading about it on Twitter, you're going to be just about as well informed of it as I am on the ground. As to the US bioweapon labs, I have heard this myself from dubious sources. I'm not ruling it out, but it's not something that I know of any evidence for. Now, the use of chemical weapons, people often ask, this question was asked in Syria a lot, well, what do you do? Why would you ever use chemical weapons when there's going to be so much international condemnation? It is because militarily, as brutal and horrible as it is, they do have a military utility, which is that basically if you're in the middle of the city and you can't destroy people through conventional weapons because they just hide in basements, you flood the place with chlorine gas, and the people either have a choice as to run out of their buildings in defensible positions, or die because of the gas. And the moment they're in the streets, well, then they're fucking easy. Able to be blown up with artillery, kind of thing. Sorry, I know this is a pretty horrible way to describe it. That's basically the point. And the point is that if anyone who's been watching this, ever been to Kiev, it's probably one of the easiest cities to defend you could possibly imagine. It's absolutely full of these, and Odessa as well. They're all full of all of these catacombs and underground tunnels. There are these massive high-rise buildings with really, really strong foundations and structures. Perfect place to put snipers in the roofs. Perfect place to put saboteur teams underneath. And it might be that chemical weapons would militarily be the only way you could take a city like Kiev.
Yeah. The reason I guess I was sort of setting it up for you, Pat, with the I mean, as Tom said, this is sort of a debate going on Twitter and not really in Ukraine about the validity of chemical weapons labs and all this kind of thing. But we wanted to ask you really about this tweet here. I'll just bring it up. About your response to Glenn Greenwald, and maybe you could expand on this. Maybe you'd be better explaining it.
Oh, right. Okay, so can you remind me? I'm just going to
hang on. Let's set this up again. Because look, I'll read out. I got my phone and your Twitter feed up here. Glenn Greenwald, who was a journalist based in the US, is seen by many as an incredibly good source of information. He's sort of mentioned sometimes in the same vein as the WikiLeaks guys and that sort of thing. He put out a tweet that said, "For the truly enthused, get your Azov Battalion merch here. Try to catch," and then mentions a link to a person's name, "in between Guardian columns and Fox hits to get some advice on what looks best." He goes on to say, "Everyone in the US with a MAGA hat is deemed a literal Nazi who you're supposed to punch and or imprison, but liberals see actual real life Nazis in Ukraine and either swoon with admiration, arm them, or call you a Kremlin agent for wondering if this might work out poorly." You responded to him by saying, "Glenn, have you considered coming out to Ukraine and using your considerable reporting skills to cover the situation on the ground? Or will you be sniping from the sidelines at journalists like," mention the journalist's name again, "risking their lives to cover war because of their old tweets?" So I guess we wanted to expand on that and have a look at that and see what you meant. See if you wanted to expand on that, or if you just turn your phone again sideways there, Tom, we'll get you back in called landscape or whatever it is. But try and figure out what's happening from there.
We might have lost Tom.
We'll see what happens with him. So there is a lot of conversation, and there are several places that I work with and for who are connected to Glenn Greenwald. So we'd really like to get Tom's perspective on this and see what happens with with a response to it. Do you want to bring up the clip? We'll scroll down, actually click on Glenn Greenwald's one there, actual Glenn Greenwald's tweet. Yep, just click on his actual tweet, and there's a product there that people can buy, and that's what he's sort of pushing out there. We'll just wait for Tom to come back and give him a chance to respond to all of that, because I'm looking up, I'm trying to get clarification as to what Azov Battalion is, the T-shirt, what Glenn's saying. It sounds like what Glenn's saying is, you know, some journalists in Ukraine are Nazis, and Tom is someone who wants to, I guess, give us some clarification on how that is not the case.
Yeah, this is something that we've briefly brought up with Tom in the past. Is the role of I guess paramilitary groups like the Azov Battalion in Ukrainian military, which is, you know, over the past few years and the conflict there, sort of been a factor, I guess, in the defense of Donbass, as he's explained in previous interviews, but really sort of been removed from the Ukrainian national military sort of since then.
Tom has just sent me a message, literally live as we're speaking, on Twitter saying "Eek power cut." So he's probably had to go find an alternate source to come back and have a chat to us about, and we'll bring you straight back in, Tom.
There's a generator on, so we're all good. Pardon me. Okay. Yeah, we just get a little bit out. Occasionally, just one of the hazards of working out here. Should I keep going where I was, or?
Well, let me just reset up what it is. I mean, we are live streaming, but you know, this is what happens when we're talking to someone in a literal war zone. You forgive me. Why don't you mention the name of the journalist? Because I'm not even going to attempt to try and pronounce that. IA.
Okay, Ilya Pomerenko. So he's a colleague of ours. He's a colleague of ours. He's not, I don't know him personally, but he's a good friend of the friend that one of the colleagues that I'm traveling with here. And basically what I get annoyed about is, there's been a lot of a big controversy about the Azov Battalion, who, yes, back in 2014, did a lot of thuggish things. A lot of their members did have quite far-right allegiances and alliances. And I'm not trying to whitewash this group, but what I do want to say is that there's been this kind of portrayal by some people, and they're usually people who tend to take the Kremlin propaganda line, which basically says, oh, the Azov Battalion exists, therefore Ukraine is a Nazified country. Now, the Azov Battalion have a political wing. That political wing got 2% of the vote in the last election. They don't even have seats in the parliament. You know, every country has a kind of a far-right extremist movement, and a political one at that. And the idea that Ukraine has some kind of big problem with it. Now, what happened with this guy is that a couple of years ago, he did an embed with this group, and he said something like vaguely positive about them. Now, this is a guy who's currently been on the front lines with the official Ukrainian army for the last 3 days, you know, in the most dangerous places in Ukraine, risking his life. And I find it extremely frustrating to have people sitting in their armchairs overseas being like, he said some things that I disagree with politically a couple of years ago, therefore he's a bad guy, therefore he shouldn't, you know, I sometimes really dislike people who are looking at this conflict from afar and sniping and attacking journalists who are putting their lives on the line, if that makes sense. That's kind of what I was getting at.
So if you scroll down a little bit there, George, so to show people again who are just joining us, the actual Glenn Greenwald original tweet. So what you're basically saying is Glenn Greenwald in this tweet is actually accusing the journalist of being a far-right sympathizer, far-right columnist. That's why he's mentioning The Guardian and Fox. And you're
he's saying the guy's a neo-Nazi with absolutely no evidence other than the fact that he did an embed with this group of people. And an embed is a perfectly legitimate journalistic thing to do, right? And it just rubs me up, really rubs me up the wrong way, especially to do it on a day that one of our colleagues got killed in the field doing this kind of reporting, right?
Yeah, I just scroll down a little bit there, George, as well. Let's just have the actual final tweet other way, just to show Tom's tweet. so we can actually then put that out there as well so people can see it if they want to see it. I'll read it out. It says, Glenn, have you considered coming out to Ukraine and using your considerable reporting skills to cover the situation on the ground? Or will you be sniping from the sidelines at journalists like Ponomarenko, the journalist, risking their lives to cover war because of their old tweets? So, look, I mean, as you've just said, on a day where the one of your colleagues has died doing that exact job, I guess armchair critics are easy to find, maybe even exact lines at the when in truth, or there are a lot of murky lines at the moment. And, you know, I'm not saying murky even for someone's like morality or reporting, but it must be pretty hard to draw a hard line sometimes when you're there having to, you know, understand everything. Whereas we're back here sitting on our couches and go, well, that's exactly how it is and that's exactly how it's not. Must be very different being in the field, not being able to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of, I want to say, for someone who has no skin in the game to say something like that. And also, I have to say, it's like, you know, Glenn Greenwald in the past has done some extremely consequential and important reporting, and no one can take that away from him. It just seems that over the last couple of years, he's taken for sure a very kind of right wing turn, and a kind of, it seems to be parroting what seems to be a pretty pro-Kremlin line on this whole invasion. And this is one of the very few kind of military offenses that I don't think there's much black and white in here. I think this is a very, very clear case of a country attacking another country because they don't like its politics or they don't like its you know, geopolitical alignments, which is just not something you can do. And to see people try to even excuse this is something that I find quite distasteful. I'm not saying that Ukraine's always been perfect or done everything perfectly. There have been some, you know, bad things that they've done, but that doesn't give the Kremlin the right to just say, I don't like this government, it shouldn't exist. This country shouldn't exist, which is what they've said.
Yeah. Hey, Tom, we thank you very much for joining us again today. Be safe. I'm hoping that we get to talk to you again maybe later on this week or something, but it's always good to talk. It's very good to flesh out some of these things that you have literal on the ground knowledge about, unlike perhaps people like Glenn Greenwald, who want to be experts from afar, sitting in their armchairs criticizing those who are actually. It's always a tough thing, isn't it, when someone's doing the hard yards, to have an armchair critic tell them they're doing it wrong or doing it badly or whatever. It's like, at the very least, you should be first doing it, walk a mile in my shoes, and then you can criticize rather than just criticizing from afar.
Exactly. You want to come down here, you want to come on the ground and, like, you know, say, oh, you're doing it wrong. Well, okay, then I feel like I can have a little bit more of a conversation. But, you know, if you someone with no experience of this conflict whatsoever, has no idea what it's like, especially this guy's a Ukrainian journalist with his homeland being attacked, well, I think I made my thoughts on that clear. But yeah, good to talk to you guys. Sorry about the little technical hiccups, but
dude, you're in a war. You're in a war zone, literally. That's all fine. We're just happy to be talking to you live in Ukraine. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk again sometime soon. Stay safe, Tom.
Yeah, we'll do. Have a good one, guys.
All right. Well, that makes for interesting conversation around what's going on there, and I wonder if people who are associated with, as I said, I know some of the people sort of tacitly who are associated with Glenn Greenwald, or certainly who have him in their either pro or con camp. And so maybe we'll get some of these messaging today. This is what they have to think about it.
It's a very similar story to how I felt with Syria. I felt that basically there was a debate within the left about even the validity of Aleppo being on fire, and the debate of the existence even of suffering in Syria while Syria suffered during those years of the Syrian civil war. You know, just as Tom was saying there, that people are very comfortable on Twitter to argue these points when it, you know, from the safety of their own home.
But you know what it probably is as well. I mean, you and I and your average Joe down the street, if we say, oh, such and such is doing it wrong in the war zone, something different, I mean, followers as I'll ever have, you know, have someone with profile who is also, let me have a look as I speak to you. Someone who, I mean, he's got 1.7 million. I mean, he's not massive in the world of media and news, but you know, someone with 17 followers living in some suburb of, you know, West Auckland saying it is very different from someone with 1.7 million who is seen as a disseminator of information and a journalist based in America. It's a very different scenario, them saying it, isn't it?
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, at the same time as that sort of, criticizing the armchair generals and armchair experts, there is a point to be made here that, we should discuss things like America's role in this conflict, for example, and question that, because really, if we look at the past 22 years, American sort of led interventions, whether they be minimal or invasions like the 2003 invasion of Iraq, have not gone well, right? And so we need to be very critical of who America is supporting, whether that be actual Nazis or just the Ukrainians themselves. We should be questioning that policy of in US intervention and that sort of thing, right? Because really, what we should be asking: what are their motives? Do they want to turn Ukraine into a killing field where they can bleed Putin dry? These sorts of lines of questioning. All of that is valid, and me and you and experts in New Zealand, in America, should be questioning our governments and their policies and all that sort of thing. At the same time, it's just being wary of calling out like a specific journalist in Ukraine and saying he doesn't know shit because once he hung out with the Azov Battalion, which is like fair. Like embedding with the Azov Battalion is not, I mean, embedding is it can be a bit of a gray area, but like if you're a reporter in Ukraine and you go and report on the Azov Battalion, surely like that's a good thing, right? You're showing that that they exist, and anyway.
It makes me think as well about I'm a big fan of Louis Theroux, and if you associated people with the people you've embedded yourself with, and his is not a war frame, but he's done several series where he's basically embedded himself with like the worst family in America and
Exactly.
with Nazis and with the porn industry and all that kind of stuff. So, and I'm sure all of them. I mean, I can't remember it. I've seen it a couple of times, but with the Nazi one that he did when he went to hang out with Nazis for a month or whatever it was, I'm sure there's somewhere in there that he says something positive, whether it's about their relationship with each other or their So do that to anybody, any journalist who's ever had an experience involved with a group that is deemed detriment to society. So and especially when it's in a war zone. I mean,
he's very sympathetic to the Westboro Baptist Church people, right? He really wants to understand where they're coming from, especially the kids, the adult children that he hangs out with, and he does the dishes with these people, right? This is something I often tell my journalism students, is that this is how you you should hang out with your interview subjects, right? Just chill with them. Like, don't sit down like a formal sort of, have questions lined out and ask them lots of questions. Hang out with them. Go to the beach with them, or do the dishes with them, or whatever it is. Make the shoes with the shoemaker, or whatever it is.
All those interviews that your students are hanging in about shoemakers, I'm sure that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Hey, let's have a chat about Three Waters, because we're going to also be talking to Jenny McGee before 11 o'clock. We've probably got 10 minutes or so to cover off the biggest story, the most complex story in New Zealand. Maybe we can't do it in 10 minutes, but let's give it a nudge. For what people who are wondering what Three Waters is, basically just think about the three. I mean, because when I first heard it, like on day one, I'm like, oh, it sounds like a very new age way of talking about some kind of, because it's the Three Waters, and it's actually just the three waters in your house. It's your sewage water, your shitter water, it's your grey water, and it's your drinking water. So I don't know. Three Waters does sound sort of super spiro and and kind of like it's something bigger than it is, but they're just talking about that. And the long story short is they're talking about taking away control, power, whatever the right word is, from local bodies, and on some level nationalizing it, or centralizing it's probably a better word, and kind of making, I think it's 5 entities, a little bit like what the DHBs are, and operating 5, if that's the right number, big entities, as opposed to, I mean, how many councils are in New Zealand? 30, 40? Like 40 little ones. And I can see the pros for that. Now I can see, for example, purchasing power, and I can see making contracts with companies to service your gear. You're going to pay a lot more for a bigger entity, but you're going to get a better price per job, or per square meter or per, whatever it is. So I get it, but it's a bit confusing. And our mate Rob Nicol, white man behind a desk, shared a little bit of information to kind of explain why this was going on and not necessarily explaining what Three Waters is, but let's just play it. Let's just roll the clip on Robbie talking a bit about it.
It's really about this tension between the central government and local government.
Councils do suck. While people are worried that the entity boards will be less accountable to the public than councils, you've got to realise that up till now, councils were only accountable to a very specific part of the public. In 2019, local government voter turnout was 42.2%. And who is that 42%? Old rich people. Local governments are heavily weighted in favour of old rich folks and their preferences, which are to not have to pay too much money in rates every year and not to invest in the future when they'll be dead.
Right. So that's a pretty blunt way of looking at it. But I mean, I suspect there's some truth in that, It's like it's if your local body is looking after infrastructure and a small percentage of people interact with local body, that means a small percentage of people are controlling the decisions. One can argue both sides of this. I get it. One could say, well, more people should get involved in local body. That's their fault. One could also argue, is it that much better who participates in the national political world? And then you're actually, let's say you've now got 60% of the voters putting in a centralized government who are now in control. I don't know, but that's sort of been the argument so far. As to control. Control sounds such a controlling term. Operational ways of the Three Waters. So there has been a backlash though, and the minister Tom Mutch was on Q&A this weekend, and she acknowledged that perhaps they'd sort of missed the mark on a few things. Let's play that clip.
But there are two areas of the Three Waters reform program which I underestimated, and I acknowledge that's my responsibility. The first one is that I underestimated that the public really knew what was happening with pipes under the ground, and they had a lot more knowledge about the trade-offs that councils were always making.
Dozens of councils.
So what we're going to do is we've invited the Mayor of Dunedin to come on and have a chat about Three Waters, sort of to get a perspective from a local body candidate. He said he's probably happy to join us next week. Obviously, he's running a city and he's busy, so that's fine. So we will continue the conversation around Three Waters and as it goes on. It has been controversial. I am interested as well, George, and I'll get your thoughts around this, about the angle that Minister Mahuta just did there, where she sort of mea culpa a little bit. And we got it wrong. It does make me think about something else that I've been seeing in the news to do with politicians' media recently, to do with the cost of living crisis. I'm going to say it's reported. It probably is accurate, but I'll still say it's reported that last week on the AM show, when the Prime Minister was questioned around this cost of living crisis, that she wouldn't acknowledge it was a crisis. They say that she actually said it wasn't a crisis. I don't know if that's accurate. I think what they're saying is that she wouldn't acknowledge it was a crisis by using the word crisis. Last week, Carmel Sepuloni, who's also a minister in the Crown, came out and called it a crisis. So, of course, the Prime Minister was back on the AM show this morning, and the first thing they wanted to do was jump down her throat about the word crisis. Let's have a look at that.
Last week, you were saying there is no cost of living crisis. Since then, one of your own ministers, Carmel Sepuloni, has said that there is a crisis for families. Was she wrong?
No, she wasn't. And, if we reflect back on that discussion we had, in that interview, absolutely all the way through acknowledging that, yes, undeniably, in fact, that was what the words I used, undeniably, there is an impact for people right now.
And Carmel Sepuloni the Minister of Social Development, has used the word crisis. So you're saying that the word crisis does apply?
Melissa, I totally agree with Minister Sepuloni that for many people it will absolutely feel like that.
But you won't say the words?
In that same interview, if I may just finish, and in that same interview, I absolutely acknowledge that for many people there is a huge impact, and in fact across the board a huge impact right now of the pandemic and a war. I think regardless of the title it's given, you can call it a crisis, an emergency, a shock. The point is, we need to do something about it. We've already started on that, and I talked a bit about that.
So let's we can leave that there. I mean, there's a couple of things, and I experienced this when I talked to James Shaw recently in my podcast, where I talked to him about Taiwan, and I really wanted to nail him down on, is Taiwan sovereign? Should it be its own country? Is this its own country? And it just wouldn't answer it. It just wouldn't answer it because obviously there are potential international ramifications that come with that, whether people think it is or it isn't.
Especially as the mayor of a city that is very connected to its Chinese population, right, and China itself.
No, sorry, I might have said the wrong name. I meant to say James Shaw, the co-leader of the Greens, is who I was asking about that. I apologize if I said the wrong name.
No, I might have got that wrong.
But it's interesting to know, looking at those two things, whether acknowledging you made a mistake like Minister Mahuta did, or fighting over a word. Because let's be honest, if the Prime Minister says this is a crisis, straight away there's a headline for the National Party talking about Jacinda's crisis. So I get it from that sort of point as well. Is calling a crisis by any other name still a crisis? Does it still smell as sweet as a crisis? Is the media being finicky over it? Is this the right response to go, you know what? I didn't use the word crisis. It is a crisis. I did use words that meant crisis, splitting hairs. What do we do with it? So I was interested as well as the response by these two politicians and what we think the correct response, the correct way to actually acknowledge perhaps a change in policy or a mistake should be done in the media.
I think the subtext to Nanaia Mahuta's one is that she maybe underestimated the pushback, right? Not the public's knowledge, but the people whose interests are served by local councils, the rich old folks that Robbie were talking about. Maybe she underestimated their influence, their interest when it comes to water infrastructure, and so maybe that was the subtext there. And really, she also that part where she says that was a mistake. That was probably part of a larger interview that she was having with the media, and at the time, it probably seemed. It seemed like she was probably having a conversation, and that sort of just flowed out as she was having a conversation about, the pros and cons of how they've been going with the Three Waters program, right? And then that specific part is taken out and able to be the headline, right? It becomes the thing that the news reports on, and that's just how it goes. And the same, you can see the Prime Minister. She's switched on to it. She knows what's going on, and she just sort of slowly says the word crisis, so that there's not that very singular sound bite. She just sort of slowly says it throughout the conversation.
Well, actually, we were going to talk a bit about the idea of centralizing recycling. Maybe we can put that onto another show another day, because actually what you've just said does dovetail into another clip with the Prime Minister. About the Prime Minister this morning. She acknowledged this in that interview that they had then. We're not going to play that part, but there's some fake news going around at the moment, which is hilarious fake news because it's got a spelling mistake in it. So if any moron out there believed it, then good on you. But about the Prime Minister requesting Ryan Bridges, that's his name, isn't it? I think that's his name, from the AM show be removed from his position. Can we just play that clip? And then I'll tell you about the smartness of not allowing yourself to have a soundbite, how that works. Let's play that clip from, I think this was this morning on the AM show.
Have you been silenced? Silent or... now, speaking of things that are probably false, take a look at this. This has been doing the rounds. It looks like a News Hub story doing the rounds over the weekend. And I can't tell, I literally had hundreds of people message me because, I don't go on my social media that often. And my friend messaged me and they said, I think you need to take a look. Have you been silenced? Silent or silenced?
You can probably just bring that volume down and leave it playing there, George, because if you read the headline, it says, PM Jacinda Ardern has filled to have Ryan Bridges banned from all major media platforms, rejects any further interviews with the reporter. So for a start, it says has filled rather than filed. So if anyone read that and thought it was a real news item, you need to check your spelling. But they addressed that this morning, and the Prime Minister actually said in this morning's conversation, the one we were playing the clip from before, towards the end of it, they kind of had a bit of a joke about this. And she actually said, welcome to my life. Prime Minister said parts of this conversation will be clipped and used by someone for some nefarious reasons. So actually, what you were just saying about maybe she's smart enough not to want to give a soundbite, she actually then acknowledged in that conversation based on, a fake headline that's going around as well. So yeah, maybe what we and I do find it frustrating when politicians don't answer questions directly. Maybe so when James Shaw wouldn't answer the thing about Taiwan, maybe they have to do that because, come 6 weeks from then, someone who's whatever side of the debate they're on, they use that clip to either support or decry theirs by showing the 6-second clip where he says, yes, it should absolutely be a sovereign nation, or he says the opposite, or whatever. So they just don't answer it.
Yeah.
Let us move on. We're going to come back to Three Waters. We're going to come back to centralizing, I guess, services for citizens and local councils as we talk through the next few weeks. But earlier this morning, George and I got a chance to have a chat with Jenny McGee. Now, Jenny McGee is a fascinating person, and you all know her story because she's the nurse that was thanked by Boris Johnson over her work in the ward where he was. Now, we aren't going to talk to Jenny about Boris's case in particular because there's privacy issues and that kind of stuff. But we do play a few clips in here about what her experience is in the UK with that. But I think more importantly and more interestingly to me, as a nurse who's been on the front line, we wanted to kind of prod Jenny for her perspective on how New Zealand's doing and our nursing with COVID, how New Zealand's doing with COVID from the perspective of someone who's been in a country where it's been far worse. To share some thoughts and share some opinions, including on the controversial issue of potentially nurses with COVID working in New Zealand wards with COVID, with patients who have COVID. If it got to a point, the government has said that could be a possibility. So let's bring that up. Let's play this out. This is a pre-record from this morning, but it's a really interesting chat that both George and I had with Jenny McGee. Let's go. Well, joining us is Jenny McGee, the nurse made famous around the world by Boris Johnson when he personally thanked her. In fact, we'll have a look at part of that clip shortly, Jenny, because I don't know about you, but it's always kind of fun to watch it again and name and stuff mentioned. I'm sure that's fine for you. Let's have a look at a little bit of that now as to what he had to say.
Good afternoon. I've today left hospital after a week in which the NHS has saved my life, no question. It's hard to find words to express my debt. I want to pay my own thanks to the utterly brilliant doctors, leaders in their fields, men and women, but several of them for some reason called Nick, who took some crucial decisions a few days ago, which I will be grateful for the rest of my life. I want to thank the many nurses, men and women, whose care has been so astonishing. I'm going to forget some names, so please forgive me, but I want to thank Poling and Shannon and Emily and Angel and Connie and Becky and Rachel and Nikki and Anne. And I hope they won't mind if I mention in particular 2 nurses who stood by my bedside for 48 hours when things could have gone either way. They're Jenny from New Zealand, in Invercargill on the South Island to be exact, and Luis from Portugal near Porto. And the reason in the end my body did start to get enough oxygen was because for every second of the night, they were watching and they were thinking and they were caring and making the interventions I needed.
Jenny, I know he was a Prime Minister of the UK and obviously a famous high-profile person. Would have say that, or does that sort of become run-of-the-mill, this is my everyday job?
There has been times when I've found that quite emotional to watch, because I think it was, especially now looking back on the, where that period when he was saying it, that was the first wave. We were about halfway through the first wave, and it makes me feel emotional looking back on it because it was my colleagues took it as a thanks to them as well, I think.
Of course.
It was a lovely gesture to the NHS. And whilst I would have loved to have had some warning about it all taking place, I think it did resonate with a lot of nurses that was a real thanks to the NHS, not just to the, it was lovely that he thanked me and Lewis, but I think it's quite sincere when he is saying that he was thanking the NHS.
I mean, it might be a little bit of a disparity, the example I'm going to get, but a lot of people accept things like knighthoods and like public awards as a recognition of the work their team and them have done for a long time. So even though it's a different example, a different proportion, I hear what you're saying is sort of similar to that, that even though he said your name, you know, all the Nicks involved and all the other nurses, it's testament to the system, as opposed, because if it wasn't you, it would have been another nurse another day with another name from another small town.
And that's, a lot of my colleagues said they were so happy that it was me, because I am just a nurse, normal nurse at work, just doing my job, and people were so kind of tickled pink by it, because you know, I'm not particularly special at work, you know, and it could have been them.
Is it true that there are a lot of doctors in the NHS named Nick? I mean, that's the biggest question.
It was just it's just that on his admission, there happened to be a lot of doctors called Nick looking after him. It was a bit weird, especially his two main doctors that he named his son after were called Nick. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realise that. So he named his son after one of the doctors.
So yeah, the two main doctors that were looking after him were, so his son's Wilfred Nicholas, and Nicholas was after the two doctors. Yeah, I mean, maybe if he had a girl, maybe Jenny. I don't know.
Next time.
So we'll see on the next one.
And I think I've seen on your Twitter or Instagram, I think, photos outside Number 10. Did that mean you went and met up with them afterwards and had a cup of tea with pinkies out and all that kind of thing?
A couple of months, so summer 2020, he invited me and Lewis and the two Nicks, the doctors, and a couple of other people from the hospital that had helped look after him, to come over to Downing Street for a tea party. And it was a really, again, just another surreal thing that I've done through this whole process. But it was a really lovely afternoon. It was actually really casual. It wasn't really pinkies out, which I was expecting it to be really formal, and I dressed up like it was going to be so formal, but it was actually a really lovely afternoon where he genuinely thanked us all for our care. It was really nice.
Hey Jeannie, did you at any time did you kind of feel awkward that did you think, hang on, I'm sort of being used as part of a political PR sort of thing here, or did you see it as an opportunity to sort of I guess you know, raise support for the NHS?
Yeah, there's definitely been times throughout this whole process where there's been things that I haven't done because I felt that it was a little more of a PR stunt. For example, at Downing Street, before we went over, an email came out asking, they said that they were going to be doing the last clap for carers was going to be this afternoon at Downing Street. And the Prime Minister's team wondered if we would go out and clap. And there was also the lady that started the clap for carers, a really lovely lady who just started it as a gesture on her street to thank the NHS. And as soon as I saw the email, I felt really, really uncomfortable about the thought of going out with Boris and clapping. And I didn't like the idea that, you know, Boris Johnson and his NHS friends all out clapping. And I didn't like that idea of it. And Lewis was the same, the nurse that was also thanked. So in the end, we didn't have to do it. But I wasn't going to do it anyway. So there have been things. I've had the opposition party approach me and ask me if I will stand up on stage with Keir Starmer, who's the opposition leader, at one of the party conferences, and it just, you know, they were giving me lots of compliments about how much they loved the NHS and that and nurses, and I just felt that it was all politically motivated. And I'm a really unpolitical person. Like, I really like to keep out of all that side of things. So there's definitely been things that I haven't done or haven't commented on because I felt really uncomfortable.
I'm wondering as well, you're obviously someone who was literally on the front line in a country that was hit pretty hard by COVID. Now you're back in New Zealand. Whereabouts are you anchored in at the moment in New Zealand?
In Nelson.
Oh, okay. So you're still, I was wondering why you didn't come all the way down south here with us, but you're still in the South Island, so that's a pass. I'm on my
way. I'll be on my way down there in a couple of weeks.
Okay, cool. So when you're going through Dunedin, stopping for a cuppa, socially distanced cuppa. So what I was thinking was, you're a Kiwi. Obviously, I would think you keep up to date with what's happening in New Zealand. As a nurse on the front line in the UK, what did you think at the time, looking back as to how New Zealand was handling COVID, seeing that's the front line you were on? And do you have any thoughts around how we're doing now that you're back as someone who's been involved in the COVID crisis more than 90%, well, 99.99% of any population?
Yeah. New Zealand has done incredibly well with their COVID response. And, you know, I was really terrified of being on the other side of the world and COVID hitting New Zealand like it was hitting us in Europe, and I was scared for my family. And so it was a relief to see the New Zealand response. Now, obviously, New Zealand's quite lucky in that they're an island nation that was able to easily close the borders. That's not something that the UK could have done. But you know, the whole world saw how New Zealand responded, and New Zealand was put up on this pedestal, and there wasn't a day that didn't go past that people wouldn't say to me, "What the hell are you doing in this country? You know, New Zealand is doing so well there. It's amazing." And, you know, 0 cases of COVID, and people were dying in droves in the UK. So it was a relief to see that happening in New Zealand, selfishly from my point of view, because I knew that my family were much safer there than what they would have been in the UK or anywhere else in the world. So, you know, it's been very, very frustrating not being able to get into the country. But again, from my point of view, my family have been safe, and yes, it's taken me 2 years to get back into the country, but I find it hard to say anything negative about the MIQ process because it has undoubtedly saved thousands and thousands of lives. And I know that because I've seen it. I've seen thousands and thousands of people dying. And I guess when you haven't had to see that and you haven't had to live through that, it's hard to agree with the MIQ process. But yeah, as I say, people overseas have just looked in awe at New Zealand.
It feels a little bit like, I mean, it's a side note, but we were talking about sort of supporting Ukraine at the moment, not to get into a political conversation, you see, it's non-political, but I feel like you can't kind of support Ukraine and putting sanctions on Russia and then complain about the price of fuel at the moment. Because the reason the price of fuel is going up because of the sanctions on Russia, and like, what I hear you saying is I hear so many people criticizing, for example, what MIQ was or the restrictions we had, not realizing that they're doing so under the safety protection given to them by those same restrictions. So it's interesting to hear you say that you don't have any really criticism, even though you're acknowledging it was hard for you to get back. But one of the reasons it was hard for you to get back was the protections that we had back here in New Zealand.
Yeah. Look, I can't understand some of the tragic stories that came out of people not being able to be with their loved ones when cricket teams have been let into the country and things like that. I can't understand that side of it, and I don't agree with it. But I think the purpose that it was set up for has done a wonderful job.
I wanted to ask you as well, as a nurse, are you coming back to nursing in New Zealand? Is that where you're going to land?
No, I'm just on holiday and here for a couple of months.
So then you're heading back again?
Yes, yeah.
Gotcha.
What's the situation like in the UK now that you're heading back to, Jenny?
So I was at work just before I came home, doing a few shifts back in ICU, and there was no active COVID cases in the ICU, which was I'm not sure if how long that was going to last, but that was just an incredible thought comparing to this time last year. So, things were very much getting back to normal. The government has kind of dropped all restrictions, and life is very much moving on.
I'm interested again as your experience as a frontline nurse in a COVID-filled ward. There was an announcement by the government about our healthcare workers here, and it was said that those nurses that are working in non-COVID areas have to stand down for 5 days and return 2 negative RAT tests before they can return to work, should they be exposed to or have COVID. But they also said staff in COVID-19 wards could return at once. I'm interested, is that something that you guys had to do at the NHS because the demand was so high? We're going through our Omicron wave now. As someone who's been on the front lines, how do you respond to that?
When I first was told that, I was shocked, actually, and it just shows the desperation that the New Zealand healthcare systems and nursing staffing levels are under if they're saying that positive people can come back and look after positive patients. Yet there's a bit of logic to it. I understand that, but and I understand that as I used to be a manager in the NHS and was through most of the pandemic. I understand you have a service to run, and a lot of people go off sick with being positive, and they might not have symptoms, but just if you're testing positive and coming back into work, it's the logistics around it. How's that person coming into work? Are they going on public transport, or are they going in a car? Like, I'm sure they've worked all this out. Or if that person's coming into the hospital and, okay, they might be working on a COVID ward, but they're probably coming through non-COVID areas, and they're probably going to the supermarket on their, like, there must be some pretty strict criteria on how you get to work and keeping people safe. And not carrying, passing it on. To me, it seems like more of a headache than what it's worth.
But that's really interesting. I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
So if you're coming to work with COVID, that means you're out and about with COVID. Yeah.
And if you aren't taking if you have a car, fine. But if you're taking public transport, it's making my mind boggle a lot. But I also think it's a very, very sad realization of how much pressure the New Zealand healthcare is under at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because even if you do take your car, you still have to walk from your car to the ward, and we're being told not to expose people if we have COVID. That's a really interesting perspective. Actually, I didn't think about that. Hey, look, finally as well, because we'll let you go. There was that famous, and not to criticize any one person, but maybe you've got a thought around this as a nurse, trying to help us all understand who have. I mean, I'm not isolating. I don't have COVID, but I'm not in my studio today because of some COVID complications from groups and stuff around me. That's why I'm remote. I think we still have to educate some people on what's happening with COVID. There was this very famous story and article with Boris Johnson before he got COVID about I've shook everybody's hand, and then like within a couple of days he had COVID, and that was a bit embarrassing. Here in New Zealand, Chris Luxon, our National Party leader, sort of did exactly the same thing these 2 years later, where he did a State of the Nation. He hugged a whole bunch of elderly people, and then literally the next day turned positive, came out as positive for COVID. As a nurse and as someone who has obviously more knowledge than most of us do and what we should and shouldn't be doing, what would you say to people at the moment in the what appears to be the peak of this Omicron wave about dealing with those and those around them to keep us and others safe? Any advice?
It's just, look, it's common sense. We've been doing this for 2 years now. If you have any symptoms, if you feel sick, get tested and stay at home, and don't go see your particularly your elderly relatives or people that might be at risk. But it is just, if you have symptoms, get a test. If you've been around people that have symptoms, get a test. And wash your hands, wear a mask in public areas. It's pretty simple stuff, and it's not a huge ask. Wearing a mask, like I had to wear a mask for 13, 14 hours of a day every single day. So wearing one of those flimsy little masks is nothing. And if you have symptoms, get yourself tested, stay at home.
Jenny McGee from Nelson, world famous nurse. I was wondering if people have approached you to do like some kind of marketing and advertising campaign you could monetize off the back of this or something, Jenny. But thanks so much for joining us today.
For the money to come in, I'm telling you, I'm ready for these opportunities. I've been paid nothing this whole process, and I'm waiting for some money to come in.
What could be a good? Maybe you could go like to America and do some walk-ons on some medical shows or something, as you know, Jenny from the NHS, and monetizes this mother.
Yeah, absolutely. I need something.
Hey, Jenny.
God.
Thanks so much for joining us. Enjoy your time in New Zealand, and it's been brilliant talking to you.
No worries. Thanks so much.
Alrighty, mighty. That's sort of us for a morning. Big congratulations to Power of Dog, Central Otago Oamaru filmed show with Jane Campion. Seems to have just won a bunch of things at the BAFTAs. Is there anything else we need to wrap up for today? For today's show, there, George? Anything we've left off?
Nope. Very happy with the Power of the Dog news. It was a good film.
You like it?
Sure.
A lot of people say it's too slow. I mean, I think it was slow, but I think, like, I watched The Godfather in the weekend, never seen it before, watched it for the first time ever. And it's, you know, it moves slowly compared to what we've been sort of trained to do of recent times and what
for sure.
ingest. And I think The Power of Dog is not necessarily a slow movie. It just feels like it's being filmed purposefully as something that you would have made in the 1960s or 70s.
It's considered, right, and it really does build that tension between Cumberbatch's character and his brother and his brother's missus. It really does build that tension that develops between them well, and also has these considered sort of landscape shots as well that show Central Otago, which is always good.
Yeah, I did a bit of research afterwards. People who have seen the film, if you haven't seen the film, you should see it. It's on Netflix, actually, isn't it? That they were actually real sets. I was wondering how much were facades, how much were, this day and age where you can drop a building into a landscape with CGI. They weren't. They were real sets that they built up in Central, and it's amazing. We were in Oamaru 4 or 5 weeks ago, and we just watched Power of Dog, and we were going, where'd they, what's that? We went down to so there's like an area of Oamaru for people who don't know it, which is called, I think it's called the Victorian precinct or something like that. And it's all buildings from the 1800s that are still getting used today as shops and stuff. And that's where they did some of the externals from the town for it. And I haven't done it. I probably should have. Maybe I'll do it today. I took a screenshot of the shot from the movie, and then I lined it up and took a photo of the building that it was coming out of, and you can kind of marry it up and line it up the ground to see if I could still smell Benedict Cumberbatch, and just did those things. That's what we do. Thanks for joining us today, guys. I know it's been a bit different, and I know that some of the audio and stuff has been a bit different, but and as you can see, I'm remote. I'm remote because of and I'll say it again, COVID complications. Not to do with me. I don't have COVID. I haven't tested positive, but where I use my studio, there is to get to it, and one of the links in those chains has caused me to not be able to get to my studio. So hopefully that's only today and tomorrow. So we'll be remote again tomorrow. Penny Ashton's going to be joining us, I believe, as a co-host, George. So you can get back to your producing duties and don't have to have your face on camera the whole time. The dog's been with me. Nala, come here. The dog's been with me the whole morning, which is really nice. Come here. Come and say hello. Up, up. Up, up. Here we go. Dog's been with me all this morning, hanging out down at my feet and chasing things outside. Off you go, mate. So yeah, that's about it, really. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for being with us. Remember, share our shit. The best way that you can support us right now is let other people know what we're doing and how we're doing it. If you go to our YouTube channel, which is scrolling across the bottom right now, we've also made a little trailer of the last 2 weeks of the show. And if people want to know more about what we do and who we are, then show them the trailer. It's 2 minutes long. It features a bunch of the people we've had on. Not all of them, but a selection of them, a bunch of them, because I didn't want to make a 9-minute trailer. And I guess we look forward to perhaps seeing you tomorrow. I was almost just waiting for you to finish the broadcast there, George, but I guess I'm still in charge of that, aren't I? So we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for your work, George. And morning at 11 a.m., all things being equal.